There was a girl sold by her own parents like a commodity, not because they were poor, but because they chose ease over love. 19-year-old Rosalie Quinn was put into a horse-drawn carriage in the dead of night, handed over to the most powerful and ruthless man in the border region, and no one looked back. But they were wrong. Because one can sell a girl, but one cannot sell her will. Like, comment the city you're watching in so I know how far this story has progressed. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. The morning they sold her, nobody cried. That was the part Rosalie Quinn couldn't shake afterward. Not the wagon ride, not the iron grip of the man who checked her teeth like she was a horse at market, not even her mother turning away before the wheels had finished rolling. What stayed with her, what lodged itself somewhere between her ribs and refused to move, was the silence. Her family stood in a row on the porch of that crumbling farmhouse and watched her go, and not one of them made a sound. Not her father, who had negotiated the arrangement over 3 evenings of whiskey and desperation. Not her older brother Cal, who'd looked at his boots the entire time. Not her mother, who had smoothed her apron twice, then gone inside. Just silence, and the creak of the wagon wheels, and the dust that swallowed everything behind her. Dry Creek had been dying for 2 years before it finally gave up entirely. The drought came the way bad things always came to that part of the territory. Gradually, then all at once. First the creek itself went shallow, then sandy, then just a pale scar in the earth where water used to run. The grass turned the color of old straw. Cattle dropped weight they couldn't afford to lose. The smaller ranches started selling off stock, then equipment, then land. By the spring of Rosalie's 19th year, half the town was already gone or going, and the other half was looking for any arrangement that might keep them from following. Harlan Cutter was the kind of man who got rich off other people's desperation. He'd arrived in the territory 8 years prior, with money nobody could account for and an appetite for land that never seemed satisfied. He bought ranches at a fraction of their value from families who had no other options. He rerouted what little remained of the creek through his property, claiming water rights that hadn't existed before he'd paid a county surveyor to invent them. He employed men whose job descriptions began and ended with making sure nobody asked too many questions. By the time the drought had ground the Quinn family down to their last few dollars and a pile of debt they couldn't service, Harlan Cutter was the only buyer left in Dry Creek. And what he wanted to buy wasn't land. Rosalie had overheard the negotiation through the thin wall between the kitchen and her parents' bedroom. She'd been sitting on the floor with her back against the wallboards, not moving, barely breathing, listening to her father's voice go from reluctant to resigned over the course of an hour. "She's 19, her father said. "She's healthy. She knows how to cook, how to keep a house." "I'm not looking for a housekeeper, Quinn." Cutter's voice was flat and unhurried, the voice of a man who had never needed to rush anything in his life. "I'm looking for a wife, or something close enough to one that it doesn't matter. She'll make a good wife. She'll make whatever I need her to make." The silence that followed that sentence lasted a long time. "The debt's cleared?" her father asked finally. "Debt's cleared. And I'll throw in another 200 on top. Get you through the summer, if you're careful." Another pause. Then, "All right." Rosalie sat on the floor and listened to the sound of her own life being settled, and she didn't move. There was something almost dreamlike about it. The unreality of hearing yourself discussed in the past tense while you were still present. She thought she might feel something enormous, some roaring grief or rage that would break her open. But what she felt instead was a strange, cold clarity, the kind that comes when something you'd almost expected finally arrives. She didn't sleep that night. She lay on her narrow cot and stared at the ceiling and thought about running. She mapped routes in her head, north toward the mining camps, east toward the rail line, south into the scrubland where nobody went willingly. But in the dark, each option dissolved into the same problem. She had no money, no connections, and no idea how far she'd get before Cutter's men found her, because they would look. Men like Cutter always looked, not because they particularly wanted what they'd lost, but because losing it was an insult they couldn't tolerate. By the time dawn came gray and thin through the window, she'd talked herself out of every escape she'd imagined. They gave her 1 hour to pack. She fit her life into a flour sack, 2 dresses, a spare pair of boots she'd repaired herself with a strip of leather and a nail. a bone-handled knife her grandfather had left her, a small book of pressed wildflowers she'd been adding to since she was 12. Her mother came into the room while she was packing and stood in the doorway without speaking. Rosalie didn't look up. "It's not a bad arrangement," her mother said finally. "He's wealthy. You'll have things you never had here." "Things," Rosalie said. "Don't take that tone." Rosalie folded her second dress and placed it in the sack. "I'm not taking any tone, Mama. This was the only option. You understand that?" "I understand it." She still didn't look up, and after a moment her mother left. Rosalie sat on the edge of the cot and held the flour sack in her lap and breathed in and out until the tightness in her chest loosened enough to let her stand. The wagon that came for her carried two of Cutter's men, a heavy-set man named Greer, who drove and spoke to her once for the duration of the first hour, and a younger man with a thin mustache who sat in the back and watched her with an expression she didn't like. Rosalie sat beside Greer on the bench and kept her flour sack in her lap and her eyes on the road ahead. The Quinn property disappeared behind a rise within 10 minutes of departure. She watched it go without turning around. Greer was the kind of man who filled silences the way some people filled rooms, automatically, without self-awareness, because silence made him uncomfortable. "You know anything about Cutter's place?" he asked. "The Broken Spur, big outfit, 50,000 acres, give or take. Running about 3,000 head last I knew." "I didn't ask," Rosalie said. Greer glanced at her. "Just making conversation." "You don't have to." He went quiet for about 20 minutes, then started again. "He's not a bad man, Cutter. Fair enough if you don't cross him. You don't cross him, you'll be fine." "And if I cross him?" Greer looked at the road. "You won't." The territory spread out around them in every direction, brown grass and hard sky and the occasional dark spine of a mesa on the horizon. It was beautiful in the way that indifferent things are beautiful, the way a drought-year landscape can still catch the light right at certain times of day and make you forget, briefly, what it's doing to everything living in it. Rosalie watched the land pass and tried to find something useful in the watching, some detail she could file away, some feature of the terrain that might matter later. She didn't know yet what later might look like, but she was already cataloging. They picked up 2 more wagons at the Bleecker Crossing settlement, a water stop roughly 30 miles south of Dry Creek that existed mainly as a place for wagon trains to resupply before heading deeper into the territory. The other wagons were freighters, stacked with supplies for Cutter's ranch, and they joined up into a small train with Cutter's men forming a loose escort on horseback. 6 riders total, though 2 of them spent more time talking to each other than watching the surrounding terrain. Rosalie noticed that. She noticed which men were attentive and which weren't, which horses were rested and which were already laboring, where the rifles were stowed and how quickly they could be reached. She wasn't planning anything specific. It was just the way she'd always moved through spaces, watchful, assessing, storing information without knowing exactly what she was storing it for. The train moved out from Bleecker Crossing in the late afternoon, heading southwest toward a pass through the canyon country that would eventually bring them to Cutter's range. The escort riders spread along the length of the wagons, and Rosalie settled in for what promised to be a long, joyless ride. The attack came at dusk, when the light was bad, and the canyon walls threw shadows that moved like living things. She heard the first shot before she understood what it was. A flat, distant crack that her mind tried to categorize as something ordinary, a branch breaking or a loose wagon board shifting. Then Greer dropped the reins and slumped sideways, and the horses screamed, and the canyon was suddenly full of sound and motion that had no orderly shape to it. "Get down!" someone shouted. She didn't know who. Rosalie was already moving. She didn't think about it. Her body simply decided that staying on the wagon bench was wrong and took her off it, dropping her to the ground beside the wheel before her mind had caught up with what was happening. The fall knocked the breath out of her, and she lay for a moment with the wagon above her and the horses thrashing in their harness and the gunfire coming from both sides of the canyon now, echoing off the rock walls until it was impossible to tell how many shooters there were. She pressed herself against the wagon wheel and tried to think. Greer was dead or close to it. She could see his boots hanging over the edge of the bench, not moving. The young man with the thin mustache had disappeared, either fled or down. 2 of the escort riders were visible, one trying to get his horse under control, one already dismounted and crouched behind a boulder with his rifle up. The other 4 she couldn't account for. The freighter wagons behind her had stopped. She heard men shouting from that direction, so not war cries, more like orders being given with the sharp, clipped efficiency of people who had rehearsed this. This wasn't random. The thought arrived with the certainty of something observed rather than deduced. The canyon walls, the timing at dusk, the way the shooting had started from positions that flanked the entire length of the train. This had been planned. Someone had known the route and the schedule. She didn't let herself think too long about what that meant. Cutter's men were either dead or occupied, and the men coming down from the canyon walls were going to reach the wagons inside of a few minutes, and being found sheltering under the wagon wheel with a flour sack full of dresses was not a position she intended to be in when they arrived. She moved. Staying low, using the wagon's bulk for cover, she worked her way to the rear of the wagon bed. The young man with the thin mustache was there, crouched behind the rear wheel, and he grabbed her arm when she appeared. "Stay down," he hissed. "They're coming down off the walls," she said. "We need to move." "We stay with the wagon." "They're going to take the wagon. That's what they came for." He looked at her like she'd said something in a foreign language. She shook her arm free and kept moving. There was a gap between the canyon wall and the last freighter wagon, a narrow space in deep shadow where the rock face jutted out and created a pocket of darkness. She made for it on her hands and knees, pulling the flour sack behind her, pressing herself into the space and making herself as small and still as possible. She could see the men coming down now. There were 8 of them, moving with practiced speed along switchback paths cut into the canyon wall that they clearly knew well. They wore bandanas over their faces and moved without speaking, which told her they'd done this before. People who'd only done something once tended to talk too much when the doing finally happened. The shooting had largely stopped. The escort riders were either dead or scattered. One horse ran past her hiding spot, at full gallop, riderless, hooves striking sparks on the rock. She pressed herself flatter. The men reached the wagons. She watched them move through the train, pulling open the freighter covers, checking contents, speaking to each other in low tones she couldn't make out. They were methodical and unhurried, which told her they weren't worried about anyone coming to investigate the gunfire. Remote canyon, bad light. Nobody expected on the road for days. She watched one of them find the young man with the thin mustache still crouching behind the rear wheel of her wagon. There was a short conversation, some things she couldn't hear, and then the young man stood up slowly with his hands raised. They took his gun and tied his hands. They were taking prisoners. That was interesting, and also terrifying. She had 2 options that she could see. She could stay in the shadow pocket and hope they left without a thorough search. Or she could move now, while their attention was on the wagons, and get far enough into the canyon darkness that they couldn't find her if they looked. The shadow pocket felt safe in the way that all enclosed spaces felt safe, but it was the false safety of something that had no exits. She moved. She ran in the dark for what felt like a very long time, but was probably less than 20 minutes. She stayed close to the canyon wall, using the rock face as a guide, moving away from the wagon train and deeper into the narrowing canyon. The sounds of the outlaws faded behind her. The sounds of the wilderness, wind in the crevices, distant movement in the scrub, filled in around her. When she finally stopped running, she was standing in a dry stream bed with no idea where she was or how far she'd come. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs and waited for them to stop, but they didn't entirely. This was the moment where the practicality she'd always relied on had to work harder than it ever had. She was alone in canyon country at night with a flour sack, a grandfather's knife, a book of pressed wildflowers, and no water. She didn't know how far she was from any settlement. She didn't know what direction she'd come from. She didn't know whether the outlaws would search the canyon or cut their losses and move on. She sat down in the dry stream bed and made herself inventory what she had. The knife was good, heavy, well made, the blade still sharp because she'd maintained it. The boots were solid. She had both dresses, which was useless, but she could use one for bedding or bandaging if she needed to. The book of wildflowers was useless in any practical sense. She kept it anyway. What she needed was water, high ground, and a direction. She got up and started moving again. The stream bed was as good a guide as anything. Dry as it was, it had been wet once, and stream beds moved generally toward lower ground where settlements were more likely. She walked with one hand lightly touching the canyon wall and watched the stars through the gap above her. trying to use them for something more than company. She walked for most of the night. By dawn, she was out of the canyon proper and into the scrubland at its eastern edge, and she was in worse shape than she'd been willing to admit to herself. Her mouth was dry and tasted like dust. Her legs had gone from tired to the particular heaviness that came after hours of unaccustomed movement on rough terrain. There was a place on her left heel where the boot had rubbed through the sock and raised a blister that had opened sometime in the previous hour. She stopped at a rock outcropping that caught the early sun and sat with her back against the warm stone and tried to think clearly. The outlaws would move on. They had what they came for. The freight, the wagons, perhaps the horses. Whether they'd send anyone after a single escaped girl was a question that split two ways. If they'd taken prisoners, they had leverage. If they'd left the prisoners behind or worse, then a missing girl wasn't anyone's problem. Cutter, however, was a different calculation. She was, by whatever arrangement her father had made, Cutter's property. Men like Cutter sent after their property. The question was whether his men would track her into the canyon country or wait for her to emerge somewhere they could watch. She was thirsty enough now that the question of water was beginning to override everything else. She pushed herself up from the rock and started looking for signs. The kinds of things her grandfather had taught her when she was small, when she'd been the kind of child who spent more time outdoors than in, before the drought had made the outdoors something to endure rather than explore. She found a seep under a rock overhang about a quarter-mile from where she'd rested. It wasn't much, a slow, dark weeping of moisture from a crack in the stone, but she cupped her hands under it and drank in small sips the way her grandfather had taught her, patient and careful, until the worst of the thirst had ebbed. She refilled the smallest of the 2 jars she'd found in the flour sack. She'd packed food and not thought about it, which was the oversight of someone who'd never been in genuine wilderness before, and capped it with a strip of cloth. When she stood up, she was not alone. He was sitting on a boulder about 30 feet away, watching her. Her hand went to the knife at her belt before she'd consciously decided to move it. He noticed, and something shifted in his expression, not alarm, not amusement, something she couldn't immediately categorize. He was older than she'd initially registered, somewhere in his mid-30s, with the kind of face that spent so much time outdoors it had ceased to be distinguishable from the landscape, tanned and weathered and marked with lines that didn't quite organize themselves into readable emotion. He wore a battered canvas coat despite the warming morning, and he had a rifle laid across his knees, pointed at nothing, which she noted. "Don't," he said. "Don't what?" "Whatever you're thinking about doing with that knife." She didn't move her hand. "I'm not thinking about anything." "You're thinking about 4 things at least," he said. "I can count them from here." She studied him. He hadn't moved, hadn't reached for the rifle, hadn't done the thing that men who intended harm usually did, which was to make themselves take up more space. He was sitting on a boulder and looking at her with the flat, assessing patience of someone who was in no particular hurry. "Who are you?" she asked. "Coulter Vance." He said it like it was information he was providing rather than an introduction he was making. Matter of fact, no particular warmth in it. The name meant something. She searched her memory and found it in fragments, pieces of overheard conversation at the dry goods store, a name mentioned in the same tone people used for weather they were worried about. Coulter Vance. She'd heard he'd killed 3 men in a single year in disputes nobody outside the territory had ever gotten clear details on. She'd heard he lived somewhere in the high country and came down only when he needed to, which wasn't often. "Are you going to hurt me?" she asked. He seemed to actually consider this, which was not what she expected. "No," he said. "That's not a reassuring delivery." "I said no. That's the answer." She released the knife handle. Her hand was still shaking, but less than before. "I'm Rosalie Quinn." "I know who you are." That stopped her. "How?" "Word travels." He shifted on the boulder, and she tensed before she understood he was simply adjusting his position. Cutter told half the territory he had a girl coming in from Dry Creek. Some of us pay attention to what Cutter does. "Why?" He looked at her steadily. "Because he gives us reasons to." She filed that away. "Are you one of his men?" "No." "Are you with the men who hit the wagon train?" "No." "Then what are you doing in a canyon at dawn watching a girl drink out of a rock?" Something that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed his face, though it didn't complete itself. Following the sound of someone crashing through scrub for the past 2 hours. You're not quiet. She felt heat rise in her face and worked to keep it out of her expression. I was in a hurry. You were. You did all right, getting clear of the canyon. He paused. Most people don't think to move when things go wrong. They freeze. Most people haven't spent much time thinking about what they'd do if things went wrong. You have? Last night was not my first bad situation. She looked at him squarely. What do you want? He was quiet for a moment. In the distance, something moved in the scrub. A bird, probably, or a small animal startled by the morning. The light had fully broken over the canyon rim now and was spreading warm and thin across the rock. Cutter's men are going to be looking for you, he said finally. Not in the canyon. They won't go in after you, there's no percentage in it. But they'll watch the roads out, the settlements, any place you might show up looking for help. I know. Do you know anyone in this territory you can trust? She thought about it honestly. No? He nodded like she'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. All right. He stood up from the boulder in one movement, careful and deliberate, keeping the rifle pointed at the ground. He was taller than she'd gauged him sitting down. My place is north of here, maybe 6 hours on foot. Less if you can keep a pace. She stared at him. You're offering to take me to your home. I'm offering to get you out of the open, he said. It's not the same thing. You can decide what comes after when we get there. Why? He picked up the rifle and settled the strap across his shoulder. Because Cutter already took one thing I cared about, he said. I'm not feeling generous toward him today. He started walking north without looking back to see if she followed. Rosalie stood in the scrubland with her flour sack and her seep water jar and her book of pressed wildflowers and watched him go. She thought about everything she knew about Coulter Vance, which was rumors and fragments, and none of it was warm. She thought about Cutter's men on the roads. She thought about the fact that she had no water past what was in the jar, and no food and blisters opening on her heels. She followed. He didn't talk much during the walk, which suited her. She wasn't interested in conversation. She was interested in reading the terrain, watching how he moved through it, where he chose to put his feet, what he looked at, and what he passed without looking. He moved through the scrubland the way she moved through a crowded room, reading it constantly, never quite at rest. Around mid-morning, he stopped at a shaded wash and pulled dried meat and flatbread from a pack she hadn't noticed he was carrying. It was strapped across his back under the coat, which was why she'd missed it, and sat down without ceremony. Eat, he said. The next few hours are worse than the last. She sat across from him and accepted what he offered without comment. The dried meat was tough and strongly salted, the flatbread stale, and both were the best things she'd eaten in memory. She ate carefully, not fast, which she could see he noticed. You're not from ranch country, he said. I am, actually. But you didn't grow up with much. No. She looked at the flatbread in her hand. Dry Creek's been dry for 2 years. We've been careful for longer than that. Your family's the Quinn spread east of the settlement? What was the Quinn spread, she said. I imagine Cutter owns it now, or will shortly. Coulter looked at her with something she couldn't immediately name. Not pity, which she would have resented, and not sympathy either, which was softer than what his face was capable of. It was something more like recognition. How long's the arrangement been in place? They negotiated it 3 days ago. I rode out yesterday morning. She paused. Before you ask? No, I didn't have any say in it. I wasn't going to ask that. People usually do. I know how Cutter works, he said simply. He doesn't give people choices. He gives them the appearance of choices. That's not the same thing. She looked at him. You sound like you're speaking from experience. He tore a piece of flatbread and chewed it without hurrying. My brother ran a small spread about 20 miles west of here. Good land, decent water rights. Cutter offered him a price. He said no. Year later, my brother had a range fire that took out 2 barns and half his winter feed stock. He paused. Fire investigation went nowhere. My brother sold the spread to Cutter at half the original asking price the following spring. Where's your brother now? Montana. He took his family and left. And you stayed? I stayed. She looked at the scrubland around them, the hard, dry grass, the scattered rock, the distant dark line of the canyon they'd emerged from. Why? He was quiet for a long moment before he answered, and when he did, his voice had the quality of something he'd said before, inside his own head many times. Because someone should. His ranch was not what she'd expected, though she wasn't sure exactly what she had expected. Small, certainly. A main structure built low against a hillside, in a way that suggested its builder had thought about wind and concealment at least as much as comfort, with a barn that was actually in better repair than the house, a corral with 4 horses in it, and the general organization of a place where work happened and appearances did not. He let her have the main room while he slept in the barn, which she hadn't asked for and which he offered without making any particular point of it. She lay on the narrow bunk and stared at the ceiling and listened to the night settle around the hillside and thought about Harlan Cutter, who had bought her from her family the way you buy a lamp you intend to put in a room and not particularly look at. She thought about her father's voice through the wall, the practiced resignation of a man who had decided something without deciding it. She thought about her mother smoothing her apron. The anger, when it came, was quieter than she'd expected. It didn't arrive as the roaring thing she'd braced for, all those months of half-aware waiting, all those years of understanding in the abstract that she was the family's expendable one. It arrived as something colder and more practical, something that felt, in the dark of a stranger's house in canyon country, like a question. What do you do now? She turned the question over for a long time before sleep finally took her. When it came without dreams. She woke to the sound of someone working outside and a bar of morning light coming through the one east-facing window. She lay still for a moment, getting her bearings. The ceiling that was not her ceiling, the smell of wood smoke and horse, the distant rhythmic sound of someone splitting wood. She sat up. Her heel had stiffened overnight around the open blister, and she grimaced when she put weight on it. She found a rag in her flour sack and wrapped it tight around the heel before pulling the boot on. Coulter was outside with an axe and a pile of pine rounds, and he didn't look up when she came out, which she appreciated. There was a water barrel near the door that was half full. She drank from the tin cup hanging on a nail beside it and looked at the territory spread out below the hillside. Long grass in a protected draw that was actually green, fed by something underground that the drought hadn't reached yet, and beyond it the canyon country stretching south toward Dry Creek and everything she was no longer going back to. "There's food inside," he said. He still hadn't looked up. "Coffee's on." "Thank you." "Don't thank me. You can earn your keep if you want to stay. There's always work." She looked at the side of his face, which was intent on the log he was positioning. "For how long?" "I don't know," he said. She went inside and found the coffee and thought about that honest, blunt, thoroughly unhelpful answer for a long time. It was the first genuinely honest thing anyone had said to her in weeks. She stayed. The first 3 days she spent mostly recovering, tending the blister, sleeping more than she was used to, moving around the small ranch on the undemanding tasks that presented themselves and that she took on without being asked, because doing nothing made her feel worse than anything she could name. She mucked the stalls. She repaired a fence section that had a post working loose. She found a hole in the roof of the grain store and patched it with material she located in the barn without asking where it was. Coulter watched but didn't comment on any of it. He came and went on his own schedule, which she didn't ask about, and spoke when there was something worth saying and not otherwise, and ate the meals she cooked without complaint and without excessive gratitude. This arrangement suited her. On the 4th day, she found the papers in the grain store. 6 folded documents that had no business being under a false board in the floor of a grain store, that had names and dates and property descriptions she was able to follow closely enough to understand that she was reading a record of land transactions. Land taken, land lost. The legal language was dense and in places clearly altered, certain words written over in a slightly different hand. She sat in the grain store with the late afternoon light coming through the repaired roof section and read through every document twice. Then she folded them carefully and put them back under the board exactly as she'd found them and went to find Coulter. He was in the corral working with one of the horses, a gray that was trying to be difficult about something and not succeeding, Because Coulter had the particular patience of someone who intended to win and wasn't in any hurry about it. "You have papers in the grain store," she said. He didn't look up from the horse. "Found those, did you?" "There was a loose board." "There was," he said. She waited. He continued what he was doing with the gray for a minute, then two, then he led the horse to the far end of the corral and came back to the fence rail where she was standing. "Those documents," she said. "Some of them have been altered." "Yes." "By Cutter." "By Cutter's lawyer. Same thing, different pen." She looked at him steadily. "Those are proof of something." "They're proof of something no judge in this territory has been willing to look at," he said, "because the judges in this territory are the second thing Cutter bought after the county surveyors." "Where did you get them?" He was quiet for a moment. "A man named Hargrove. He worked Cutter's books for 6 years and got tired of what he was writing in them. He brought me what he could before he left." "Hargrove left the territory?" "Hargrove's dead," Coulter said. "Fell down a mine shaft about 2 months after he came to me. The investigation concluded it was an accident." The word accident sat between them for a moment. "Cutter killed him," she said. "That's what the evidence suggests, if you're willing to look at it plainly." She thought about Greer dropping off the wagon bench in the first second of the ambush. She thought about the papers with their careful alterations, the surveyors paid to invent water rights, her father's voice going from reluctant to resigned in the span of an hour. "Those documents," she said. "If someone could get them to the right authority, someone outside the territory, someone Cutter doesn't own—" "I've thought about that," Coulter said. "I've thought about it a lot." "And?" He looked at her with the flat, measured expression she'd started to read as not absence of feeling, but something closer to its careful management. "And I haven't figured out how to get someone who can't be bought to look at them long enough to understand what they're looking at. Cutter's got reach. You'd be surprised how far. But it's possible." "Most things are possible," he said. "That's not the same as being likely." She turned and looked south toward the canyon country, toward the flat distant smear on the horizon that was the valley where Dry Creek sat drying in the sun, and Harlan Cutter moved through the territory like a man who had never considered the concept of consequences. "Tell me what you know about his operation," she said. "All of it." Coulter looked at her with an expression that was harder to read than usual. Then he leaned on the fence rail and started talking. She listened to everything. She asked questions that were specific and did not let him generalize when he tried to. By the time the light had gone orange and the horses were moving toward the feed trough, she had a clearer picture of the valley's particular misery than she'd had even living inside it. The families still on their land and terrified to leave it, the water arrangements that had been quietly strangled, the men Cutter employed who existed solely to ensure that nobody found the energy to resist. "He's been doing this for 8 years, she said when he'd finished. "Yes." "And it's just been accumulating." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. The word that kept coming up in her head was wrong, but it felt too small for what she was looking at. The scale of deliberate harm organized over years, the particular cruelty of making people feel like their own failure was to blame for what was being done to them. "What would it take," she said, "to actually stop him? Not chase him off, not make him uncomfortable. Stop him." Coulter studied her face. "Why are you asking me that?" "Because I think you've been asking yourself the same question for long enough that you must have some answers." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, he said, "It would take getting those documents in front of a territorial judge who doesn't work for Cutter. It would take witnesses who are willing to speak on record. It would take enough ranchers standing together that the cost of suppressing all of them exceeds whatever benefit Cutter gets from the land." "That's possible," she said. "It's dangerous." "So is the alternative," Rosalie said. "So is just letting him keep going." She looked at the green draw below the hillside, that small protected pocket of grass that the drought hadn't reached, fed by whatever underground source ran quietly beneath the rock. It was so small, but it was there, and it was still green, and it was because something underneath had found a way to persist. Coulter said nothing for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before, something that might have been hope if you were looking at it from the right angle, or something like it. "You're serious," he said. I am. You understand what you're talking about doing. I understand enough. She met his eyes. Do you? He turned his gaze toward the south, toward the valley, toward the 8 years of accumulated wrong that was just sitting there, waiting. Yeah, Coulter Vance said. I do. The plan they built that first evening was not a plan so much as a direction, a rough bearing taken in bad light, full of gaps they both knew were there and didn't name. Rosalie understood that. She'd grown up watching her father make plans that dissolved on contact with reality, and she'd learned early that the difference between a plan that worked and one that didn't wasn't usually the quality of the thinking. It was whether the people making it were willing to adjust when the ground shifted under them. Coulter was willing. That much she'd established. What she hadn't established yet was how far that willingness went, whether it stopped at the boundary of his own property or whether it extended into the kind of territory that got men killed in mining shaft accidents. Over the next few days, she watched him the way she'd watched everything since childhood, with the quiet, cataloging attention that people mistook for passivity. She watched how he handled the horses, patient with the difficult ones, not in the soft way that suggested sentimentality, but in the way of someone who understood that force was the least efficient tool available and used it accordingly. She watched how he read the land, how he moved through it, where he looked when he thought no one was watching him look. He looked south, often, with the particular expression of a man who has something unfinished in that direction. On the 5th morning, she found him at the table before dawn with the papers from the grain store spread in front of him, not reading them. He'd read them enough that reading wasn't the point. Just looking at them the way you look at a problem you've been carrying so long, it started to feel like furniture. She poured herself coffee and sat down across from him without being invited and looked at the papers too. Hargrove marked the altered sections, she said. It wasn't a question. She'd noticed the faint pencil marks on her second read, small, careful notations in a different hand from the alterations themselves. He was meticulous, Coulter said. That's what got him killed, probably. A less careful man would have taken less and been less dangerous. Or a less careful man wouldn't have been believed. She turned one of the documents toward her and looked at a section near the bottom where a property boundary had been redrawn in ink that didn't quite match. Who authenticated these originally? County Recorder's Office. A man named Sessler. He's been in Cutter's pocket since at least 72. Is Sessler still in the position? Still in the position. She thought about that. So the official record has Cutter's version. These are the originals Hargrove pulled before the alterations were filed. That's right. Which means if someone examined both sets, the discrepancies are obvious, Coulter said, to anyone who knows what they're looking at. So we need someone who knows what they're looking at and can't be influenced by Cutter. There's a federal land commissioner out of the district capital, he said. Commissioner Aldridge. He's not local. He was appointed from outside the territory 2 years ago, and he's made Cutter uncomfortable enough that Cutter's tried to have him reassigned twice. She looked up. And failed? So far. That's our target, then. Coulter picked up his coffee and looked at her over the rim of the cup. Getting to Aldridge isn't the hard part. Getting him to act on what we bring him, against a man with Cutter's resources, with witnesses who are terrified to speak. That's the hard part. Witnesses, she said. How many families are still on their land in the valley, under Cutter's arrangement? 11, maybe 12 that I know of. There were more, but some sold and some just left. 11 families, each of them with their own story of what Cutter's done. Each of them too frightened to tell it. But not unable to, she said. Frightened and unable are different things. He set the cup down. You make it sound straightforward. I know it's not. She leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, thinking. But right now those families are isolated. Each one of them thinks they're the only one suffering it, or that the others have given up, or that speaking means they'll be next to have a barn fire. If they knew the others were willing, if they could see that they weren't alone in this, you want to organize them. I want to give them a reason to organize themselves. Coulter was quiet for a long time. Outside, one of the horses moved in the corral, a sound like restless weight shifting. The pre-dawn dark was starting to soften at the edges of the window. Rosalie, he said, and it was the first time he'd used her name, she noticed. Cutter has 8 armed men on his payroll that I know of. Possibly more. He has legal cover in this territory that runs 3 layers deep. He's done this for 8 years and nothing has touched him. He looked at her directly. I'm not saying don't try. I'm saying understand what you're trying. I understand it, she said. Do you think the 11 families on that land don't understand it? They've been living inside it. Say, he had no answer for that. She didn't push it. She picked up the paper with the most legible alterations and studied it until the light through the window had shifted enough to read by without squinting. They sat in the early morning quiet, and each of them thought about what came next, and neither of them pretended it was going to be easy, which was its own kind of honesty. She rode out with him 2 days later to the first of the Valley ranches, a small operation called the Mercer Place, run by a man named Denton Mercer and his wife Bess, who opened the door when they knocked and looked at them with the eyes of someone who'd learned to be suspicious of visitors because visitors meant either trouble or news of trouble, and both were bad. Coulter, Mercer said. Not warmly, but not cold either. The tone of a man acknowledging a neighbor in complicated times. Denton. This is Rosalie Quinn. She was with the wagon train that got hit in the canyon. Mercer looked at her. You're the Quinn girl, the one Cutter. Yes, she said. He let them in. The house was the interior of careful, grinding poverty. Everything worn, but nothing dirty. Everything mended past the point where mending was dignified and into the point where it was just survival. Bess Mercer set coffee on the table without being asked and sat down beside her husband and looked at Rosalie with an expression that was partly curiosity and partly the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that had stopped trying to hide itself. You want to talk about Cutter, Mercer said. We want to talk about the land commissioner, Rosalie said. Aldridge. That got a reaction. Mercer straightened slightly. Bess's hands went still around her cup. What about him? Mercer said. We have documentation of altered land records, original surveys versus what was filed. We're trying to build a case that's strong enough to bring to Aldridge, strong enough that he can act on it even against Cutter's legal cover. Documentation's not enough, Mercer said. Hargrove had documentation. Hargrove's dead. Hargrove went alone, Rosalie said. He didn't have 11 families with him. Well, Mercer looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Coulter. You believe she can do this? I believe she understands the situation better than most people I've talked to, Coulter said. And I think doing nothing has a cost too. It's just a slower one. Bess Mercer made a sound, but not a word. Something shorter and more private, a small exhale of feeling that she didn't dress up as anything else. Her husband glanced at her. We lost the East pasture last fall, Bess said. Her voice was flat and even. Not to drought. To a water claim Cutter filed in September that nobody knew about until October when his men showed up and said the creek feed on the east side was his now by right of filing. We'd been watering that pasture for 11 years. She looked at the table. 11 years. Mercer put his hand over hers. He didn't say anything. Tell me what you need from us, Bess said. We're not promising anything, but tell us. Rosalie told them. She kept it specific. What the documentation showed, what additional testimony would strengthen it, what the process of reaching Aldridge might look like. She didn't make promises she couldn't keep. She didn't soften the part about risk, because the Mercers already knew the risk better than she could articulate it. An insult was the last thing they needed. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet for a moment. There are others, Mercer said. The Calloway family, the Hadleys, old Finn Pryor. He's still on his place, even though Cutter's been trying to dry him out for 2 seasons. I know Pryor, Coulter said. He's stubborn enough to talk, Mercer said. I can't speak for the Calloways. They've got young children. That changes the math. I understand that, Rosalie said. Anyone who says no, that's their right, and it goes no further. We're not here to pressure anyone into something they're not able to do. Mercer looked at his wife. Something passed between them that was too quiet and too long established to be called a conversation. More like 2 people checking a reading they'd already taken. We'll talk, he said. Come back in 2 days. They visited 3 more ranches before the week was out. The Hadley place was a harder conversation. Luther Hadley was a large, angry man who'd been large and angry before Cutter and had additional reasons for it now, and his anger made him suspicious of everything, including help. "You're the girl Cutter bought," he said, standing in his doorway without moving aside to let them in. "What's your interest in taking him down? Seems like your problem's already solved if you're here instead of there." "My problem isn't solved," Rosalie said. "My problem is the same as yours. It's the same as everyone in this valley's problem, which is that there's a man who treats people as things he can acquire and use, and nobody's done anything about it for 8 years. Because there's nothing to be done. That's what he wants you to think." Hadley looked at her with the flat skepticism of a man who'd had optimism ground out of him one slow season at a time. "You're 19. "Yes." "You've been in the territory, what, 2 weeks? Less. And you're going to fix what 8 years couldn't fix." "I'm going to try," she said. "Whether it works depends partly on whether people like you decide that trying is worth something, or whether they're going to let Cutter's version of events stand because the alternative is hard." She looked at him without blinking. "That's your choice, Mr. Hadley. Not mine." He didn't answer immediately. His jaw worked like he was chewing something unpleasant. Then he stepped back from the door. "You better come inside, Joe," he said. Coulter caught her eye as they followed Hadley in, and for a brief moment his expression broke from its usual flatness into something that was distinctly, recognizably surprised. She looked away before it became a moment. Finn Pryor was 81 years old and had been on his piece of ground since before the territory had its current name, and he received the news of their plan with the calm of a man who had stopped being surprised by events sometime in his 60s. "Cutter sent 2 men last spring to make me an offer," Pryor said. He was sitting on his porch in a chair that had been repaired so many times it was more repair than chair, with a rifle across his knees that he hadn't put down since they arrived, but also hadn't pointed at them. "I told them the price was not anything Cutter could pay." "What price is that?" Rosalie asked. "Whatever I say it is," Pryor said. "That's the point of it." She liked him immediately. He listened to the full account of the documents, the commissioner, the plan. He asked 2 questions, both specific and sharp. Then he said, "I'll speak on record. I've been speaking on record to anyone who'd listened for 3 years and nobody's done a damn thing about it, but I'll speak again." "This time we're bringing it somewhere it can't be ignored," Rosalie said. "People have a talent for ignoring things," Pryor said. He looked at Coulter. "You trust her?" Coulter considered this with more visible deliberation than she expected. "I trust her thinking," he said finally, "and I think she's right that doing nothing has a cost." Pryor looked at Rosalie. "That's high praise from him." "It didn't sound like praise," she said. "That's because you don't know him yet." Pryor rocked back in the repaired chair. "Come back when you've got the others. I want to know who's standing before I stand." The complication arrived 8 days after Rosalie had come to the ranch, in the form of 2 riders who appeared on the high ground south of Coulter's property in the late afternoon and stayed there long enough that there was no reasonable interpretation except deliberate watching. Coulter saw them from the barn. He came inside without running, which she noticed, and stood at the window for a moment looking south. "Cutter's men?" she asked. "One of them works for Cutter, the other I don't know." "They found me." "They found where to look," he said. "They're not coming down today. They're checking the ground." "How long do we have?" He turned from the window. His expression had shifted into something harder and more focused, and she could see for the first time why people in the territory spoke his name with the particular careful tone she'd overheard in the Dry Creek dry goods store. He didn't look dangerous the way she'd expected dangerous to look. Not loud, not large, not theatrical about it. He looked like a man who had calculated the necessary thing and was now simply preparing to do it. "Day, maybe 2, he said. "We need to move faster than we planned." "The Callaways," she said. "We haven't talked to them." "I know." "And the paperwork. If we're writing to the district capital, we need copies. If something happens to the originals—" "I know," he said again. "I've got a man in Bleecker Crossing who can make copies. We go to the Callaways tomorrow morning early, Bleecker in the afternoon, and we're moving north toward the capital before Cutter's men can organize." She looked at the window where the 2 distant riders were still visible against the ridge line. "And if they follow?" "Then I deal with that," he said. "That's not a plan. It's the part of the plan that covers whatever the plan doesn't cover." He held her gaze. "It's worked before." She didn't ask him to elaborate on that. Some things were better left unelaborated. The riders on the ridge moved off as the light failed, disappearing over the back of the hill without coming down. She watched them go from the window and felt the particular compressed tension of something she couldn't calculate, the gap between what she could control and what she couldn't, which was wider than she liked and narrowing. She went back to the table and the papers and kept working, because that was the only available response to a situation that was running faster than she was ready for. Coulter came in from checking the horses and sat across from her, and they worked by lamplight on the sequence of what needed to happen, talking through contingencies in the quiet, practical way they'd found was their natural register. Not easily, because neither of them were naturally easy, but honestly, without the performance of certainty that neither of them could afford. "You're not scared," he said at some point. She looked up. "I didn't say that." "You don't seem it." "Scared and paralyzed aren't the same thing," she said. "I've been scared since my father closed that deal. It hasn't stopped anything from needing to be done." He looked at her for a moment, the same considering look she'd caught twice before, the one that suggested recalibration. "No," he said. "I suppose it hasn't." She went back to the papers. He went back to the map he was tracing on a piece of leather, marking the route north, calculating distances in his head, and transferring them to something she could reference if they got separated. The lamp burned. Outside, the high country dark pressed against the windows, and somewhere to the south, Harlan Cutter's men were deciding how quickly to move, and the clock that had always been running on this situation was running faster now. Rosalie Quinn, who had been loaded onto a wagon 11 days ago in the belief that her life was over, looked at the document spread before her and felt something clarify in her chest that was not hope exactly. Hope was too soft a word for it, but something with hope's direction and fear's weight, and the particular density of something that had been decided and could not be undecided. She sorted the papers into order and tied them with cord from her flour sack, and when Coulter blew out the lamp and went to the barn, she lay down on the narrow bunk and closed her eyes and did not sleep for a long time. But she wasn't still. Her mind was moving, already somewhere north of here, already in the room with the commissioner, already building the argument she hadn't quite finished yet. Tomorrow they would ride for the Callaway place at first light. The day after that, Bleecker Crossing. And after that, whatever came next. The Callaway place was the quietest of all the ranches they'd visited, and quiet, Rosalie had learned, was not the same as peaceful. May Callaway answered the door with a child on her hip and another one visible behind her legs, and she looked at Rosalie and Coulter with the expression of a woman who had been waiting for bad news long enough that she'd stopped distinguishing it from other kinds of visitors. "Tom's in the field," she said. "We can wait," Rosalie said. May looked at her for a moment, really looked, the way women looked at each other when they were trying to determine something specific. Then she stepped back from the door. Tom Callaway came in from the field 20 minutes later, still carrying the tension of interrupted work in his shoulders, and he sat at his kitchen table and listened to the full account without interrupting. He was younger than Rosalie had expected, late 20s, with the kind of face that had been weathered past its age and was only now catching up to what it looked like. He held his coffee cup in both hands and didn't drink from it. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "May," he said finally. "I heard," his wife said from across the room. "What do you think?" May shifted the child on her hip. "I think Cutter's going to take this land whether we fight or not. He's going to find a way. He always does." She looked at Rosalie. "The question is whether we let him do it without saying what he is." Tom looked at his coffee. If this goes wrong, we're exactly where we are now," May said. "Except we tried." It wasn't a comfortable logic. Rosalie could see Tom turning it over, testing its edges. She didn't press him. She'd said what she came to say, and the decision belonged to the Callaways, not to her. "What do you need from us, specifically?" Tom said. "Testimony on record. What Cutter's done to your water access, your grazing rights. Specifically, and in detail." "And you think this Commissioner Aldridge—" "I think he's been looking for grounds to move against Cutter for 2 years," Rosalie said. "I think we're going to give him those grounds." Tom set the coffee cup down carefully, the way you set something down when you're making a decision and want your hands free. "All right, 8, he said. "But I need 2 days. I've got feedstock that needs moving before I can leave the place." One day, Coulter said, we have a window, and it's closing. Tom looked at him. One day, then. He paused. Cutter's going to know we're involved. Cutter's going to know everyone's involved, Coulter said. That's partly the point. Eed. They rode for Bleecker Crossing in the early afternoon with the cord-wrapped documents in a saddlebag that Rosalie kept her hand near without consciously deciding to. The copyman Coulter knew was a former land surveyor named Elias Drum, who'd retired to the settlement and supplemented what he had with careful, precise copywork. Documents, contracts, anything that needed a clean and accurate duplicate. Drum was a small man who moved slowly and precisely, like someone who had learned early that haste produced errors, and errors had consequences. He looked at the documents for a long time before he said anything. These are alterations over originals, he said. I can see the original ink underneath in 3 places. Can you document that? Rosalie asked. In a way that would be clear to someone who isn't a surveyor? Drum looked at her over the papers. I can mark the discrepancies with notations. I can write an assessment of the alteration method and when the overwriting was likely done based on the ink oxidation. He paused. That's the kind of thing that holds up in a federal proceeding. How long? Tonight and tomorrow morning. I'll have everything ready by noon tomorrow. Rosalie nodded. We need 2 complete copies. One for the commissioner and one that stays with someone Cutter can't reach. Finn Pryor, Coulter said. She looked at him. You trust him? I trust that he's been on that land for 50 years and isn't leaving it, which means if we need to find the copies, we'll know where to look. Drum had already started laying the documents out on his work table with the careful, methodical energy of a man who had found something genuinely interesting. Come back at noon, he said without looking up. They left him to it. What? The problem arrived that evening in the form of Greer, or rather, in the form of someone Rosalie recognized as Greer's replacement, a man named Solt, who worked for Cutter, and who was sitting at a table in the settlement's only eating establishment when they came in for a meal. He saw her. She saw him see her. There was a half-second of mutual recognition, and then Solt was on his feet. Coulter moved first. He was between Solt and the door before Solt had fully stood, and he did it without appearing to hurry, which was the most unsettling version of fast that Rosalie had ever seen. Sit down, Coulter said. Solt was bigger than Coulter and knew it, and was calculating what that meant in this specific situation, which was a calculation that took him about 4 seconds before he sat back down. I'm just eating, Solt said. Keep doing that. The girl's Cutter's property. You know that. The girl, Rosalie said from behind Coulter's shoulder, is standing right here. Solt looked at her. He had the particular blankness of a man who had been employed for a long time to carry out decisions he wasn't asked to participate in making, and who had stopped expecting the decisions to be wrong. Mr. Cutter's going to want to know where you are, he said. Mr. Cutter already knows generally where I am, she said. His men were on the ridge 2 days ago. Tell him I said hello. Solt's eyes moved to Coulter. You're making a problem for yourself, Vance. I've had problems before, Coulter said. Finish your meal, then ride back and tell Cutter whatever you're going to tell him. But if I see you on my property or anywhere near the people we've been speaking to, we're going to have a different conversation than this one. The silence in the room had the quality of something stretched. 3 other men were eating at separate tables and had gone very still in the way of people who were tracking something without wanting to be noticed tracking it. Solt picked up his fork. His jaw was tight and his eyes were saying things his mouth had decided not to say, but he put food on the fork and ate it, and Rosalie and Coulter took a table on the far side of the room and ordered what was available and ate it without looking at Solt again. He's going to ride tonight, Rosalie said quietly over her plate. Yes, Cutter will know we're at Bleecker by morning. He'll know we were at Bleecker. By morning, we'll be somewhere else. She looked at him. You're sure about the route north? I've ridden it 4 times. There's a way through the high country that doesn't go near any road Cutter owns or watches. He paused. It's not comfortable. I wasn't looking for comfortable. He almost smiled. It was the second time she'd seen the beginning of it. No, he said. I didn't think you were. Oh. They left Bleecker before dawn with the copied documents in 2 separate saddlebags, Drum's written assessment folded inside each set, and a route north that climbed into the high country within the first 2 hours and stayed there. The cold was significant, late season cold with a bite that came off the upper rock faces and went straight through a canvas coat, and the terrain was the kind that asked questions of horses and riders alike. Rosalie answered the questions it asked. Her heel had healed to the point where the boot didn't matter much anymore, and she'd spent enough time on horseback in her childhood that the animal under her felt like a known variable in a situation full of unknown ones. They rode mostly in silence, which had become their natural state. Not uncomfortable silence, but working silence, the kind that left room for attention. She spent the first hours watching the country behind them and the country ahead in roughly equal measure. Coulter did the same, and twice he altered the route without explanation, taking them away from a ridgeline or a gap in the rock that she understood, on reflection, would have made them visible from below. "You've had people following you before," she said, when they stopped mid-morning to rest the horses at a spring. "Yes." "Cutter's men?" Cutter's men were the most recent. He watered his horse with the flat practicality of someone whose animal's needs registered before his own. "I was a range detective for a while, years back. That kind of work makes you enemies on several sides." "Is that where the reputation comes from?" He considered this. Some of it. Some of it comes from being unwilling to pretend things are other than they are, which some people experience as aggression." She looked at him over the back of her horse. "That's an interesting way to put it. It's accurate. What happened with the range detective work?" A pause that was longer than his usual pauses. "I stopped being willing to do it for the people who were paying me," he said. "The men I was tracking down were mostly small ranchers running a few extra head to make up for what the big outfits were already taking from them. That's not the kind of work I could keep doing." "So you quit?" "I quit, and I came up here, and I've been watching Cutter make the valley worse for 8 years. He pulled the horse back from the spring, which is its own kind of failure. You couldn't have done anything alone. That's what I told myself." He looked at the spring rather than at her. It got less convincing over time. She let that sit. She understood it. The particular corrosion of inaction that you couldn't justify and couldn't quite bring yourself to end, and the way it wore at a person's sense of themselves until the wearing was its own kind of damage. She'd watched it in her father, the slow collapse of a man who had known something was wrong and had found every reason except the right one to keep from saying so. The difference was that Coulter was still capable of being corroded by it. That meant something was still intact. "You're doing something now," she said. He swung up onto his horse without answering, but she caught his profile for a moment before he turned north, and what she saw there was not nothing. They reached the district capital on the third day of riding, coming down from the high country into a town that felt aggressively organized after the raw territory they'd come through. Wide streets, permanent buildings, the sound of commerce and administration happening simultaneously in a way that made Dry Creek feel like a memory from another century. Commissioner Aldridge's office was on the second floor of a federal building near the center of town, and his secretary, a thin, precise young man who reminded Rosalie of Elias Drum in temperament if not in age, told them the commissioner was in a meeting that would conclude within the hour. They waited. Rosalie sat in a chair outside the office and kept the saddlebag in her lap and watched people move through the building, clerks, petitioners, men with the bearing of lawyers who billed by the quarter hour. She thought about what she was going to say. She'd been composing it for 3 days on horseback, and it had gone through several versions, and the current version was still not quite right in places she could feel but not yet name. Coulter sat beside her without fidgeting. She found, not for the first time, that she appreciated that about him. The door opened and 3 men came out, and then Commissioner Aldridge appeared in the doorway. Shorter than she'd imagined, with a gray beard kept more neatly than the rest of him suggested he cared about appearance, and eyes that moved across the waiting area with the quick, assessing quality of someone who'd been in administration long enough to read a room by second nature. "Mr. Vance," he said, recognizing Coulter with what seemed like genuine if cautious interest. "I didn't know you were coming." "Neither did I, 3 days ago," Coulter said. Aldridge looked at Rosalie. "And you are?" "Rosalie Quinn. I was part of an arrangement Harlan Cutter made with my family in Dry Creek. I'd like to tell you about that and about several other arrangements he's made in the valley over the past 8 years, and I'd like to show you some documents that I think you've been looking for." Aldridge was quiet for a moment. His expression didn't change dramatically, but something behind it shifted in the way of a man who has been patient for a long time and has just been given a reason to stop being patient. "Come inside," he said. The meeting lasted 4 hours. Rosalie spoke for most of it. She laid the documents out in the order Drum had recommended. Originals first, then the copies with Drum's assessment, then the marked alterations cross-referenced against the official filed versions that Aldridge was able to pull from his own records. She named the families. She named the water claims. She named Hargrove and the mine shaft, and the investigation that had concluded it was an accident. Aldridge listened the way good listeners listened, with his whole attention and very few interruptions, and the interruptions he did make were specific and sharp, asking for clarification on details that she'd summarized when he needed the full version. Coulter spoke when she deferred to him, which was twice, once on the question of Cutter's relationship with the county recorder Sessler, and once on the range of Cutter's land holdings, and how the acquisitions had been sequenced over time. He spoke plainly and without embellishment, and the plainness of it had its own weight. At the end, Aldridge sat back in his chair and looked at the document spread across his desk for a long moment. "This is enough to open a formal inquiry," he said. "The alterations alone, with Drum's assessment, are actionable at the federal level. Cutter's relationship with Sessler gives us the scope of the corruption." He paused. "But an inquiry takes time. It takes process. And in that time, Cutter is going to know something is moving against him." "He already knows something is moving," Rosalie said. "His men have been watching us for over a week." "Then he's going to accelerate," Aldridge said. "He'll start pressuring the families you've spoken to. He'll try to get ahead of the testimony by making the witnesses unavailable. Which is why the inquiry needs to move faster than he expects it to," she said. Aldridge looked at her with an expression that she read as something between respect and the particular wariness that respect sometimes produced. "You understand that I can start this process, Miss Quinn. I cannot guarantee how it ends." "I understand that. Cutter has resources I can't fully counter. He has lawyers, he has influence in places that even federal authority feels. I understand that too. And you still want to proceed." She thought about Bess Mercer's hands going still around the coffee cup. She thought about May Calloway with a child on her hip, saying the question is whether we let him do it without saying what he is. She thought about Finn Pryor in his repaired chair, saying, "I'll speak again with the patience of a man who had never expected speaking to be easy." "I want to proceed," she said, "and I think you do too." Aldridge looked at her for a moment longer. Then he looked at Coulter. "She's right," Coulter said simply. Aldridge gathered the documents with the careful hands of a man who understood what he was holding. "I'll need 2 weeks to build the formal record before I can move openly. During those 2 weeks, you need to keep your witnesses safe and your contact with them quiet." He looked at Rosalie. "Can you do that?" "We can try," she said. It was not the answer he'd been hoping for, but it was the honest one, and something in his expression said he recognized it. "Come back in 2 weeks," he said. "And don't let Cutter get to those families." They rode out of the district capital in the late afternoon with the copies secured and Aldridge's formal case number written on a folded piece of paper in Rosalie's coat pocket. The original documents were on their way into federal custody, which meant they were, for the first time, beyond Cutter's reach. It should have felt like relief. It felt, instead, like the moment before weather. That atmospheric pressure shift when you know something is coming and all you can do is determine whether you're in the right position for it. "He's going to move against the families," she said. "Yes. Before Aldridge can get the inquiry open publicly." "That's the play," Coulter said. "Pressure the witnesses until they recant or disappear. Make the case structurally weak before it's formally brought." He paused. "It's what I would do if I were him." She looked at him. "Is that supposed to be reassuring?" "It's supposed to be accurate." They rode in silence for a while. The sun was going down behind the western range, painting the sky in the particular reds and golds that the territory produced when it was not trying to kill anything. "The families need to know what's coming," she said. "They need to be ready for it." Ready meaning armed. Ready meaning decided, she said. Armed follows from decided. If they've truly chosen to stand, then Cutter pressing them is just confirmation that they chose right. If they haven't truly chosen, if we've talked them into something they're not committed to, then pressure will undo it and will have put them in harm's way for nothing. Coulter looked at her across the distance between their horses. You're thinking about the Callaways. I'm thinking about all of them, but yes, the Callaways especially. No, Tom Callaway made his choice. His wife made it first, Rosalie said. He caught up. Coulter said nothing, but she could see him filing that observation away, which was something she'd noticed he did. He stored what she said and came back to it later, tested it against what he saw. It was a form of respect she recognized because it was the form she practiced herself. We go back through the valley, she said. We talk to each family again. We're honest about what's coming, and we let them reconfirm. That takes time we may not have. Then we move fast, she said. We've been doing that. The territory spread out ahead of them in the failing light, vast and indifferent and full of the kind of difficulty that didn't ask your permission before it arrived. Rosalie looked at it without flinching, which was not the same as not being afraid. She was afraid. She'd been afraid since the wagon left her family's porch, and she'd learned that fear was not a stop sign. It was just information about where the edges were. She knew where the edges were now. She knew what Cutter was capable of, and what the families were risking and what Aldridge could and couldn't do. She knew where Coulter's limits were and where hers were, and she knew that the gap between what she knew and what she'd need to know before this was finished was significant. None of that changed what needed doing. She touched her heels to her horse and picked up the pace, and after a moment Coulter matched it, and they rode north into the coming dark together. They rode back into the valley on the 6th day, and the valley had changed in the way that places change when something invisible has shifted in them. Same land, same sky, same brown grass going to seed in the drought, but the air carrying a different quality of tension, like the moment before a storm when birds stop moving. The first sign was the Hadley place. Luther Hadley's fences had been cut on the eastern boundary, clean cuts, not weather damage, not an animal pushing through, and 2 of his cattle were missing. He was standing at the break in the fence when they rode up, and his face had the set look of a man who was angry past the point where anger was useful and had moved into something colder. When? Coulter asked. 2 nights ago. Hadley looked at the cut wire. Left a note on the post, said I'd lose more if I kept talking to people I shouldn't be talking to. Did you keep the note? Hadley reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper without a word. Rosalie took it and read it. Brief, unsigned, the handwriting deliberate and even, which told her it had been written by someone accustomed to producing written communications rather than someone in emotional heat. This is from Cutter's lawyer, she said, or written by him anyway. This is legal handwriting. Hadley looked at her. How can you tell? The phrasing. Continued activities contrary to existing arrangements. That's not how a ranch hand talks. That's how a man who bills $4 an hour talks. She folded the note back. This is good. There's nothing good about my cattle being gone, Hadley said. The note is good, she said. It's threatening a man for exercising his legal right to speak. That's actionable. It goes to Aldridge with everything else. Hadley stared at her for a moment with an expression that was trying to decide between irritation and something more complicated. You find silver linings in the strangest places, he said. I find what's useful, she said. That's all. They stayed at the Hadley place long enough to take down a full account of the fence cutting and the missing cattle, dates, times, what had been seen, what hadn't. Hadley dictated and Rosalie wrote it out in her clearest hand on paper Coulter produced from his saddlebag. Hadley signed it without being asked, which she noted because it mattered. A signed statement had different weight than a verbal one. The others, she said when they were preparing to leave, have you heard anything? Pryor's all right. Stubborn old man, nothing touches him. Hadley's jaw tightened. The Mercers had a man come to the door 2 days ago. Don't know what was said. Bess Mercer sent word that they were fine, but the word came through Pryor, which means she didn't want to be seen sending it directly. That was the Mercers working the problem with the intelligence they had. Rosalie filed it. The Callaways? Coulter asked. Hadley was quiet for a beat that was 1 beat too long. Heard Tom Calloway had some trouble with his well, something in the water. Rosalie looked at Coulter. He was already looking at her. We'll go to the Calloways next, she said. May Calloway met them at the gate rather than the door, which told Rosalie something before a word was spoken. She had both children with her, and the look of a woman who hadn't slept in 2 nights but was not going to discuss that. Tom's inside, she said. He's not good. Tom Calloway was sitting at the kitchen table with a cloth wrapped around his right hand and an expression that had been wrung out of whatever it started as and left as something flat and guarded. The well had been poisoned, not lethally, or at least they didn't think so, but enough to make him sick for a full day and kill 3 of their chickens. He'd figured it out when the chickens went first, which was the only reason the dose hadn't been worse. I should have sent May and the kids away when you came the first time, he said. This isn't your fault, Rosalie said. No, it's Cutter's fault. His voice was flat. But it's my problem. He looked at his wrapped hand. The well water had done something to the skin when he'd first reached in to check it, before he'd understood what he was dealing with. I'm not recanting. I want to be clear about that. I'm not. Tom, May started. I'm not, he said again. More quietly, but with the same weight behind it. He looked at Rosalie. But I need May and the kids somewhere safe. Before this goes any further, that's my condition. That's not a condition, Rosalie said. That's a reasonable thing. Where can they go? My wife's people are north, 3 days' ride. He looked at May. You take the children and go to your mother. May's expression was complicated in the way that expressions are when the right answer and the wanted answer are different things. And you stay here alone. And I stay here, and I keep my word to these people. He said it like it was already decided, which maybe it was. You didn't marry a man who goes back on his word, May. You knew that. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, 3 days there, 3 days back. You'd better still be standing when I get back, Tom. I plan to be. Rosalie spent the next hour helping May pack what she and the children would need, and in that hour, May Calloway said almost nothing directly but communicated, through the organized efficiency of her packing and the precise way she kissed the top of each child's head. Everything that needed saying. She was frightened, and she was angry, and she was proud of her husband in the specific, complicated way that came from knowing someone well enough to see all their flaws, and choosing them anyway. When they left the Calloway place, Tom was standing on the porch watching his family's wagon diminish down the road. He didn't wave. Coulter's ranch felt different on their return. Not unsafe, but watched in a way that the high country isolation had previously prevented. Rosalie had been right that Cutter's men knew the general area. Now they knew it more specifically, and the difference between generally and specifically was the difference between a problem and an urgent problem. He's moving up his timeline, Coulter said that evening. He was cleaning his rifle with the methodical attention he gave to everything that needed attention. Poisoning the Calloway well. That's not intimidation anymore. That's active harm. He's trying to collapse the case before Aldridge goes public, which means Aldridge needs to go public faster than planned. 2 weeks was his estimate. 2 weeks was too slow before we knew about the Calloways. She sat across from him at the table. We need to go back. Coulter looked up from the rifle. If we leave the valley now, I know, but if we stay in the valley and Cutter gets to even 2 of the families, the case weakens. Aldridge needs to open the inquiry publicly. Once it's public, Cutter loses the option of quiet suppression. He can't make witnesses disappear from a formal federal inquiry without it being obstruction. He's capable of obstruction. He's capable of a lot of things, she said. But everything he does from this point forward adds to the case against him. The fence cutting, the note, the poisoned well, that's not just intimidation, that's evidence of consciousness of guilt. Coulter set the rifle down and looked at her in the particular way he had. Assessing, not unkind, checking something he hadn't quite finished checking. You've been building this argument the whole ride back, he said. Since the Hadley fence, she said. Yes? All right. He picked the rifle back up. We leave at first light. She almost said something else, then didn't. There was a version of this conversation that went somewhere more personal, toward the acknowledgement of what they'd been doing together for the past 2 weeks. what had built between them in the working silences and the shared meals and the late-night lamp work. She was aware of it the way you were aware of weather building, not dramatically, just present and accumulating. She let it accumulate. This was not the time, and she suspected Coulter knew that too, and the fact that they both knew it without having to say it was, itself, something. They didn't make it to first light. The rider came in at midnight, Finn Pryor's youngest hand, a boy of about 16 who'd ridden hard enough that his horse was lathered, and he himself was barely articulate when he arrived at the door. "Red Canyon," he said between breaths. "Cutter, he's calling a meeting, all the Valley Ranchers, tomorrow morning. He's saying it's to discuss water arrangements for the coming season." The boy swallowed. "But Mr. Pryor says it's not about water." "No," Coulter said. "It's not." Rosalie was already working through it. Red Canyon was a wide, flat-bottomed canyon about 8 miles south that served as a natural meeting ground, big enough for a crowd, bounded enough to feel contained. Cutter would know the families had been speaking to Aldridge. This was his move to get them all in one place, under his terms, before the federal inquiry could go public, to present them with whatever offer or threat he'd decided on, and to see who broke and who didn't. "How many of his men?" she asked the boy. "Mr. Pryor counted 8 riding out from the Broken Spur last evening, maybe more." "Armed?" "They're always armed." She looked at Coulter. "If we can get to Aldridge tonight, it's 6 hours to the capital. If you ride hard..." "If I ride hard..." He was already looking at her with the understanding of where this was going. "You're not suggesting we both go." "Someone needs to be at Red Canyon," she said. "Someone the families trust." "You've been in this valley 3 weeks. The families have been dealing with Cutter for 8 years, she said. 3 weeks of someone treating them like they have the right to decide their own lives. You'd be surprised what that's worth." He looked at her steadily. "I don't like this." "I know, but Cutter's going to have armed men. The ranchers have guns too. Hadley alone is carrying enough anger to substitute for 3 men. She met his eyes. "I'm not going to do anything stupid, Coulter. I'm going to be there so the families know someone is with them, and I'm going to buy you time to get back with Aldridge." "How long can you buy?" "As long as it takes," she said, which was not an answer but was the only honest one available. The silence between them had the particular weight of something that needed saying and wasn't going to be said right now. "Stay visible," he said finally. "Don't give Cutter a reason to isolate you from the group." "I know." "If it goes wrong before I get back?" "Then I'll figure out what to do next," she said. "Same as I've been doing." He looked at her for another moment. Then he turned to the boy. "Can you ride back to Pryor tonight?" "Yes, sir." "Tell him Vance is going to the Capitol, and Rosalie Quinn will be at Red Canyon by morning. Tell him to make sure the other families know she'll be there." He looked at Rosalie one more time, quickly, with the restrained quality of a man who had decided that whatever he was feeling was not the most important thing right now. "Get some sleep, 2 hours at least." "You too." "I'll sleep when this is done." He was saddling his horse within 10 minutes. She stood in the doorway of the ranch and watched him ride south into the dark. Fast, steady, no wasted movement, the way he did everything. And then she went inside and lay down on the bunk and closed her eyes and did not sleep for most of the 2 hours she'd been given. Red Canyon in early morning light was almost beautiful, in the way that places built for difficult things sometimes were. The canyon walls high and pale gold in the first sun. The flat floor wide enough that 100 people could stand without crowding, the air still and cool from the night. It was a good place for a reckoning. Rosalie noted that without warmth. She arrived before Cutter. The ranchers were already gathering. The Mercers, the Hadleys, Tom Calloway standing alone at the edge of the group with his wrapped hand in his coat pocket. Finn Pryor in the repaired chair someone had carried out for him and set on the canyon floor like a small piece of defiance. 4 other families she recognized and 2 she didn't, who must have come from holdings further out that she hadn't visited. Pryor caught her eye when she dismounted and gave her a nod that was brief and total, the gesture of a man conferring standing. Denton Mercer came to her. "Vance?" "Riding for the Capitol. He'll be back with Aldridge, but it takes time." "How much time?" "Enough," she said, with more certainty than she had. Mercer looked at her for a moment. "What's the play?" "We listen to what Cutter says. We don't agree to anything. We keep him talking as long as we can." She paused. "And we make sure everyone here knows that their testimony is already in federal hands. Whatever he threatens, whatever he offers, the information is already out there. It can't be taken back." "Does he know that?" "He's about to." Cutter arrived with 8 men, as the boy had reported, all armed, ranged loosely behind him in the way of men who were there to imply a thing rather than say it. Cutter himself was exactly as she'd imagined him from her father's account and Coulter's, a large man who'd learned to let his size do early work in every room he entered, with the controlled patience of someone accustomed to having the outcome of conversations decided before they started. He saw her and stopped. She watched him recalibrate. She could see it happen. The recognition, the reassessment, the decision about what her presence meant and how to handle it. "Miss Quinn," he said. His voice was even and not loud and carried the natural authority of someone who had never needed to raise it to be heard. "You're a long way from where you're supposed to be." "I'm exactly where I mean to be," she said. He looked at her the way he'd probably looked at a lot of things that had surprised him, with the brief, cold attention of a man deciding whether the surprise was significant or not. Then he turned to the assembled ranchers with the ease of someone shifting a conversation that had gotten off on the wrong foot. "I've asked you all here," he said, "because I think there's been some confusion in the valley about how our arrangements stand. I want to clear that up, directly and in person." "What kind of confusion?" Hadley said. He was standing with his arms crossed and the look of a man who had decided before arriving that he was not going to enjoy this. "The kind that gets people into trouble they don't need," Cutter said. "I've heard that some of you have been speaking to individuals who are interested in disrupting the way this valley runs. I want to give you the opportunity to step back from that before it becomes something you can't step back from." "You poisoned my well," Tom Calloway said from the edge of the group. His voice was flat and entirely without tremor. Cutter looked at him. "I don't know anything about a well." "Then your men acted without instruction, which means you've lost control of your operation, which is interesting in its own way." A silence moved through the canyon that had a particular texture, the silence of people who had thought something for a long time and heard someone else say it out loud. Rosalie stepped forward, not dramatically. She was done with anything that resembled performance. She stepped forward the way you step forward when you've decided something and want your body to confirm it. "Mr. Cutter," she said, "the documents Hargrove took from your records before he died are in federal custody. Commissioner Aldridge received them 6 days ago. The formal inquiry has been opened." She paused, letting that land. "The question of whether these ranchers speak on record is no longer the question. The question is whether you'd like to let this proceed through legal process, or whether you'd like to add obstruction of a federal inquiry to the list of things you're already answering for." Cutter looked at her. The controlled patience had not disappeared, but something underneath it had shifted, a tightening, a recalculation happening behind the even surface of his face. "You're a 19-year-old girl from a bankrupt farm," he said. "I'd think carefully about what you're doing." "I've thought carefully about everything I've done," she said. "That's rather been the point." Cutter's men had moved, she noticed. Not dramatically, but the loose arrangement behind him had tightened, angles shifting. She kept her eyes on Cutter, and not on the men, because looking at the men was where this could go wrong. "Anyone who has signed any document," Cutter said to the group, ignoring her now with the deliberate quality of a choice rather than an oversight, "has a period of time to reconsider. I'm offering that period now. After that, I can't speak to the consequences." "Can't or won't?" Pryor said from his chair. Cutter looked at the old man. "Mr. Pryor." "I've been on this land since before you knew this territory existed," Pryor said. "You've been trying to dry me out for 3 seasons. You've failed 3 seasons running." He settled back in his chair. "I'm not interested in your period of reconsideration." What happened next was not a single dramatic moment, but a series of small ones. Mercer moved to stand beside Pryor, then Hadley, then Tom Calloway, who crossed from the edge of the group to the center with his wrapped hand in his coat pocket and his jaw set. The 2 families she didn't know followed. She didn't know their names, but she watched them make the decision in real time, watched the thing that had been frightened and isolated find, in the simple fact of other bodies standing in the same direction, something it could attach itself to. It was not triumphant. Some of them were shaking. One woman was holding her husband's arm with the grip of someone who needed the contact to stay upright. But they were standing, and standing together was something Cutter's money and his men and his 8 years of careful, grinding pressure had never quite been able to produce. Rosalie stood in front of them and felt the weight of what was behind her and looked at Harlan Cutter across the canyon floor. "The inquiry is open," she said. "It's public record as of this morning." She had no way of knowing if that was true yet. It depended on Coulter reaching Aldridge and Aldridge moving faster than his stated timeline. But Cutter didn't know that either, and the uncertainty was worth something. "You can send your men home, or you can compound what you've already done. That's the only choice you have left." Cutter looked at her for a long moment. Behind him, his men were very still. Then without a word, he looked at the assembled ranchers. Really looked. The way a man looked at an account that wasn't adding up. And she could see him doing the arithmetic that she'd been building toward for 3 weeks. The arithmetic of what it cost to move against 11 families in full view of a federal inquiry, versus what he stood to lose by backing down. "This isn't finished," he said. "No," she said. "It's not. That's rather the point." He turned and walked back through his men, who closed around him and moved out of the canyon with the organized efficiency of people who had also been doing arithmetic and had reached the same conclusion their employer had. The canyon was quiet for a moment after they'd gone. Then Hadley let out a breath that was roughly the size and shape of 2 years of accumulated frustration, and Bess Mercer sat down suddenly on a rock like her legs had made a decision she hadn't been consulted about, and somewhere behind Rosalie somebody was crying in the quiet, private way of someone who hadn't expected to be standing here. She stood in the morning light and felt the shaking in her own hands, which she'd been suppressing for the last 20 minutes, and let it happen now that there was no longer a reason not to. Pryor looked at her from his chair. "Vance will be back," he said. Not a question. "He'll be back," she said. "Good." Pryor folded his hands in his lap with the satisfaction of a man who had waited a long time and found the waiting had been worth it. "Then we hold." She looked at the canyon entrance where Cutter's men had disappeared, then south, where the territory opened toward everything unfinished, and she thought about a wagon leaving a porch in the early morning and the silence of people who didn't look back, and she thought about what it meant to hold, not in the passive sense of enduring, but in the active sense of maintaining ground that you had decided was yours. They held. Coulter came back in the late afternoon of that same day, and he did not come back alone. Rosalie heard the horses before she saw them, a sound larger than 2 riders, larger than 4, and she was standing at the canyon's southern edge, where the ranchers had made an informal camp after Cutter's departure, unwilling to disperse back to their individual properties until something more settled had been established. She turned toward the sound and counted, and stopped counting at 11 because the detail that mattered was not the number but the figure riding at the front of the group beside Coulter. Commissioner Aldridge had not waited for his timeline. He dismounted with the efficiency of a man who had ridden hard and intended to work harder, and he had with him 4 federal marshals and 2 clerks whose saddlebags were visibly heavy with the kind of paperwork that preceded official action. He looked at the assembled ranchers, at Pryor still in his carried-out chair, at Hadley with his arms crossed, at Tom Calloway with his wrapped hand, at the others. And then he looked at Rosalie. "Miss Quinn," he said, "I understand there's been a development." "Cutter was here this morning," she said. "He issued what could reasonably be characterized as threats to the assembled witnesses. One of his men was present for all of it." Aldridge nodded once, the nod of someone adding a line to a document he was already composing in his head. "That would be obstruction of a federal proceeding." "That's what I thought, too." He almost smiled. "You made the right call, getting these people together. A unified group of witnesses is considerably harder to intimidate than individuals." He glanced at Coulter. "Your man here was persuasive." "I was accurate," Coulter said. "That's not the same thing." "Where's Cutter now?" Aldridge asked. "He rode south after the confrontation. Toward the broken spur, I'd assume." "Then that's where we go." Aldridge turned to his marshals with the coordinated ease of a man who had run operations before and had not enjoyed the parts where things went sideways. "We move on the broken spur before he has time to organize a legal response. I want Cutter served and his record secured before anyone on his payroll has the opportunity to remove or alter anything. One of the marshals, a tall woman named Graves who had said nothing since arriving, but had been watching everything with the flat attention of someone professionally trained to watch, turned her horse south without waiting for further instruction. The others followed. Aldridge looked at Rosalie one more time. "You should come," he said. "For the record, and because this started with you." The Broken Spur was a large operation by any territory standard, the main house substantial enough to call itself a house rather than a structure. The barns and outbuildings arranged with the orderliness of a place that had been built in phases over years, each phase larger than the last. It sat on 50,000 acres of land that had been accumulated one pressured transaction at a time. And looking at it in the late afternoon light, Rosalie understood for the first time the full scale of what Cutter had built. The physical scope of it. The years. Cutter came out onto the porch when he heard the riders. He stood and looked at Aldridge and the marshals and the federal paperwork that was visible even from a distance in the way that federal paperwork always was. Not the paper itself, but the quality of attention surrounding it. His face did something complicated. "Commissioner," he said. "Mr. Cutter." Aldridge dismounted and climbed the porch steps with his hat in his hand, which was not deference. It was the gesture of a man who understood that the courtesy of forms existed separately from the content of what he was about to do. "I have a federal warrant for the examination of your land records and financial documentation, and a separate warrant for your appearance before a federal inquiry into allegations of land fraud, falsification of public records, and interference with federal proceedings." Cutter looked at the warrants for a long time. "My lawyer," he started. "Is welcome to join us at the inquiry," Aldridge said. "The date and location are in the second document." His men had appeared from the barns and outbuildings, 6 of them, then 7, moving with the uncertain energy of people who had been told to be available, but not what for. Graves and the other marshals positioned themselves without drama, not blocking anything, not drawing weapons, but placed in the way of people who understood positioning. Nobody drew. That was the thing Rosalie would remember afterward, the anticlimax of it, the way 8 years of a man's power could arrive at its ending, not in gunfire, but in a man standing on his own porch reading a piece of paper with the expression of someone doing arithmetic that was not coming out right. Cutter looked up from the warrant at Rosalie. She was still on her horse. She hadn't planned it. She'd simply not dismounted yet. But she was aware, in the moment his eyes found her, of how it read. A girl who'd been loaded onto a wagon and sent away from everything she'd known, sitting on a horse watching a federal warrant served on the man who'd bought her. She held his gaze and didn't look away, and didn't say anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. He went inside with Aldridge and the clerks. Marshal Graves came alongside Rosalie's horse and looked up at her. "You want to come in?" "Not particularly," Rosalie said. Graves nodded. "Then you can wait. It'll take a while." It took 4 hours. The sun went down while Aldridge's clerks worked through Cutter's files, and lanterns were lit inside the main house, and the golden light through the windows made the whole scene look warmer than it was. Coulter dismounted and stood near her horse, and they waited in the way they'd learned to wait together, without filling the time with words that weren't necessary. At some point, Coulter said, "You're not going to feel what you think you're going to feel." She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "When it's done. People expect something large. Usually it's just the next thing." She thought about that. "You've seen this before." "I've seen the end of things before. The relief comes later and it's smaller than you expect. What you get in the moment is mostly just tired." She looked at the lit windows. "I'm already tired." "Then you're ahead of schedule." She almost laughed. It was not quite funny, but it was close, and the closeness of it was its own kind of relief. Harlan Cutter was taken into federal custody that night on a combination of the documentary evidence and the obstruction charge from Red Canyon, which Aldridge told her was tactically the most valuable thing that had happened that morning, not because obstruction was the most serious charge, but because it had witnesses, it had happened in daylight, and it was incontestably recent. The older charges needed the full inquiry to establish, The obstruction charge established immediately that the man was willing to intimidate witnesses in real time, which colored everything else in a way that was difficult to argue around. The county recorder Sessler was removed from his position within the week, replaced by a federal appointee while the inquiry ran. Two of Cutter's men cooperated with investigators in exchange for reduced exposure, and what they described in their depositions added texture to what the documents had established. The systematic nature of it, the decades of small, careful pressures applied to people who had no legal recourse and no reason to believe anyone was watching. Someone had always been watching. That was the thing. Hargrove had watched and died for it. Finn Pryor had watched for years and refused to leave his land. Coulter had watched from his hillside ranch with the particular combination of guilt and helplessness that comes from knowing something is wrong and not yet knowing how to move against it. The watching hadn't been useless. It had accumulated into the thing that Rosalie had walked into and gathered up and carried to a federal commissioner. She thought about that sometimes, in the weeks after. The way justice, when it came at all, was never the product of a single person's courage. It was the accumulated weight of everyone who had refused to entirely look away, over a long time, waiting for the moment when looking away finally became more costly than acting. The inquiry ran for 6 weeks, and Rosalie was present for most of it, not as a witness primarily, though she gave a full account of the arrangement her family had made with Cutter and what it represented, but as the person who had organized the case and who understood the documentation better than anyone except Aldridge and his clerks. She sat in the back of the inquiry room and listened to 11 families tell their stories on record for the first time, and the stories had a cumulative weight that individual accounts didn't. The way the same pattern repeated across a decade, across different families, different ranches, different forms of pressure, always arriving at the same destination. Tom Calloway testified in the second week, with his wrapped hand still visible, and described the poisoned well with the same flat, controlled voice he'd used at Red Canyon. The inquiry board listened without interrupting. The silence in the room during his account was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of people giving something the attention it deserved. Bess Mercer testified about the water claim on the East Pasture. 11 years, she said. And the steadiness in her voice was the steadiness of a person who had decided that the only way through a thing like this was to say it as clearly as possible and let it be what it was. Finn Pryor, who had been speaking on record for 3 years and never been heard, sat in the chair that had been placed for him at the testimony table and said everything he'd been saying for 3 years, and this time someone was writing it down with the authority of a federal proceeding behind the pen. Aldridge moved through the evidence methodically, in the way of someone who had been building toward this for 2 years and was not going to rush it now that the materials were in hand. He was not a dramatic man. He did not try to make theater of the process. He presented evidence, heard testimony, and allowed the accumulated record to speak in the way that record spoke, plainly, without flourish, with the particular power of documented fact. Harlan Cutter's lawyers argued. They argued well, and some of what they argued had merit in the narrow technical sense of the law, and some of the proceedings were slower and more difficult than they might otherwise have been because of it. The law was not, Rosalie learned through 6 weeks of watching it operate, a clean instrument. It was imprecise in places and slow in others, and susceptible to the kind of maneuvering that well-paid lawyers were expert at. But the alterations in the land records were not something that could be argued around. Drum's assessment, meticulous, specific, cross-referenced against the official filed versions, established beyond reasonable contest that the official documents were not the originals, and that the changes had been made in a pattern that consistently benefited a single party. That was the spine of the case, and Cutter's lawyers could put pressure on the ribs, but they couldn't break the spine. The ruling came on a Thursday morning in the 7th week, and it came in the specific, undramatic language of federal land administration. A 12-page determination that found the alterations material and fraudulent, ordered the restoration of land records to their original surveyed boundaries, and referred the criminal matter to territorial prosecution. Rosalie read all 12 pages in the inquiry room after the session closed, sitting alone at the table with the document in her hands. Then she folded it and put it in the inside pocket of her coat and went outside into the street. Coulter was waiting with the horses. He looked at her face and didn't ask anything. "It's done," she said. He nodded. They stood in the street for a moment in the ordinary afternoon light, with people moving around them the way people moved in administrative towns, purposeful, incurious, absorbed in their own accounting. The world had not visibly changed. The buildings were the same buildings. The street was the same street. She thought about what he'd said outside the broken spur. You're not going to feel what you think you're going to feel. He'd been right. What she felt was tired, and something underneath the tiredness that was quieter and more complex than relief, and underneath that, further down, something that was taking its time arriving and might turn out to be in a few days or weeks, something close to peace. Let's go home, she said. He looked at her. It was the first time she'd said it, home, and they both knew it, and neither of them made anything more of it than a small, private acknowledgement. Yes, he said. Let's, see. The land restoration took considerably longer than the ruling. It took the better part of a year. The legal mechanism of unwinding 8 years of fraudulent transactions was slow work, involving county surveyors and federal clerks, and the kind of documentation that multiplied with every step of the process. Some families got their land back in full. Some had lost portions that had been sold to third parties who had no knowledge of the fraud, and those cases were settled through a territorial compensation fund that Aldridge managed to get established, which was not perfect. It was never going to be perfect. But it was something, and something was different from the nothing that had existed before. Cutter was tried in territorial court 14 months after the federal inquiry closed. His lawyers negotiated a plea on the land fraud charges that kept him from a longer sentence in exchange for cooperation with the identification of all properties fraudulently acquired. He served 4 years and was released, and he left the territory the week of his release and did not return. Rosalie heard about it secondhand and felt almost nothing. The particular absence of feeling toward a man who had been enormous in her life for a period of time and then had simply become irrelevant. She had more complicated feelings about her family, and she allowed herself the complicated feelings without trying to organize them into something cleaner. Her father had written twice. She'd read both letters more than once and had not yet responded and wasn't sure she would, or when, or what she would say if she did. Her mother had not written. That absence told her everything she needed to know about where her mother had landed on the question of what had been done, and she kept it at a measured distance, neither forgiven nor obsessed over, just placed. Set on a shelf in a part of herself she visited occasionally but didn't live in. Her brother Cal came to see her in the spring of the year after the ruling, arriving at the ranch on a borrowed horse with the expression of a man who had rehearsed several different conversations and wasn't sure which one he was going to have. He stood in the yard and looked at the ranch, at the house, at the barn, at the green draw that was still green even in the 3rd year of the drought. And then he looked at his sister. "You look different," he said. "I probably am," she said. He stayed for 3 days, and the conversation they actually had was not any of the ones he'd rehearsed. It was halting in places and honest in others, and it covered ground that had been unspoken between them for years. The way the Quinn family had organized itself around the avoidance of difficult truths. The way Cal had known what was coming the night of the negotiation and had said nothing. The way saying nothing had its own particular cost that he was still paying. "I should have done something," he said on the second evening. "Yes," she said. "You should have." "I didn't know what—" "You knew enough," she said. "You just decided that not knowing what to do meant not doing anything. That's a choice, Cal. Doing nothing is still a choice." He sat with that for a while. She let him sit with it. "I'm sorry," he said, and then, quieter, "I don't know if that means anything." "It means you know what it is," she said. "That's a start. But I'm not going to tell you it fixes it, because it doesn't." He left on the 3rd day, and she watched him go from the same porch she'd watched a lot of things from, and what she felt was not warmth exactly, but something that was at least the beginning of a possibility, of a relationship rebuilt, slowly, on more honest ground than it had stood on before. Maybe. If he did the work. If she decided it was worth the effort. Both were open questions, and she was learning that open questions were not always problems. Sometimes they were just time. The ranch expanded by spring. Not dramatically. They added a second small structure that could house settlers passing through who needed a stopping place, and they put in a larger kitchen garden than the previous seasons, and Coulter acquired 2 additional horses that he was training with the same patient, unflashy method he applied to everything. A young couple from the south of the valley arrived in March, newly married and looking for work while they saved enough to establish their own claim. They stayed through summer and into fall, and the girl, 17, sharp, with the watchful eyes of someone who'd learned early to read rooms, reminded Rosalie in ways she didn't try to articulate of herself. She gave the girl work and honest wages and the occasional piece of direct advice, and she did not try to make the advice larger or more instructive than it needed to be. She'd had enough of people who thought wisdom was best delivered in the shape of lessons. What she offered instead was the specific and practical. Here's how you handle a difficult negotiation. Here's how you read a land document. Here is what to watch for in the behavior of people who want something from you. The girl listened with the attention of someone who understood that useful information was rare and worth keeping. Good. That was exactly right. Coulter proposed to her in November, in the kitchen, over coffee, in a way that was so thoroughly him that she almost laughed. Not from the nervousness of it, because he was not nervous, but from the quality of its directness, the absence of theater. "I think we should make this formal," he said, "if you want to." She looked at him across the table. "That's not what a proposal sounds like. That's what mine sounds like." She considered him, this man who had found her drinking from a rock seep in a canyon and had offered her a direction north without making a production of it, who had ridden 6 hours in the dark to get a federal commissioner and come back with 11 riders, who had said I stayed because someone should, with the matter-of-fact weight of a person who had decided something important a long time ago and was still living inside the decision. "Yes," she said. "I want to." He nodded. Then he drank his coffee. She did laugh then. She couldn't help it, and she didn't try to. They married in the spring with the ranchers from the valley present and Finn Pryor in attendance in his chair, which had been repaired again over the winter and had at this point more repairs than original material and was the better for it. Aldridge sent a letter. The young couple who'd been staying helped set up the tables. It was not a perfect day. The wind came up in the late afternoon and blew dust across everything and knocked over 2 of the table arrangements, and someone's horse got into the kitchen garden and had to be extracted with a combination of patience and profanity and Rosalie's dress, which she'd made herself over 3 weeks, which she was proud of, which was not quite even at the hem, got a tear in the side seam from a nail on the barn door that she didn't notice until 2 hours after it happened. She repaired it that evening with the same thread she'd used to make it, sitting in the kitchen while the last of the guests finished saying their goodbyes, and she sat with the imperfection of the day and found that she didn't mind it. Perfect days were invented for people who couldn't tolerate reality. This was a real day, with real wind and real dust and a real tear and a real dress that she'd made with her own hands, and it was enough. More than enough. There is something that happens to a person who has been told, early and often, that they are less valuable, less capable, less entitled to take up space and make decisions and matter in the accounting of things. The telling goes in and stays in, and it shapes the way a person moves through the world in ways that are hard to trace because they feel like the self rather than something done to the self. You internalize the diminishment. You start doing the diminishing for them before they have to. Rosalie Quinn had been doing that her whole life. She had been careful and quiet, and had watched rooms and cataloged exits, and made herself small in the particular way of someone who has learned that making herself large costs more than she could afford to pay. And she had been, in that careful smallness, absolutely paying attention to everything, to everyone, to what was wrong and how it was wrong, and what the gap was between what existed and what might exist instead. What she learned in the year that followed the wagon leaving her family's porch was that the watching had not been wasted. The skills she'd built in diminishment, the precise attention, the ability to read rooms without appearing to, the habit of cataloging what mattered and setting aside what didn't, was the same skill that had made it possible to build a case out of scattered pieces, to talk 12 frightened families into standing in a canyon, to look a powerful man in the eyes and say, "The inquiry is open," and hold his gaze until he blinked. The diminishment had been done to her. The attention was hers. There was a lesson in that, though she didn't think of it as a lesson because lessons were things other people drew from your experience, at a safe distance. What she had was something more immediate and less tidy. The knowledge, lived into through a specific hard year, that the people who are told they don't matter are often the ones paying the closest attention to what does. That being underestimated was a door left open by people too confident in their own accounting. That courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision, made again and again in different forms, that what needed doing mattered more than how frightened you were of doing it. She was still frightened sometimes, of the wrong choices she might make, of the things she couldn't predict or control, of the space between what she intended and what the world would do with her intentions. Fear did not stop. It changed shape. It became a different kind of companion, less paralyzing, more informative, something you checked in the way you checked weather before a long ride, not to stop yourself from going, but to know what to wear. But Dry Creek got its creek back in the 4th year. The drought broke, not dramatically, not in a single redemptive rain, but in the slow, unglamorous way that droughts broke. 1 inch at a time over a wet winter, the ground gradually releasing its grip on the water table. The creek coming up through the spring melt until it ran again in its old channel, shallow at first and then less shallow. Rosalie rode out to see it, alone, on an afternoon when Coulter was working with the horses and didn't need her. She sat her horse at the bank and looked at the water moving, brown with runoff still, not yet clear, but moving, which was the thing that mattered. The Quinn farm was empty. Her parents had gone to her father's sister's place in the east, she'd been told. The land was for sale, had been for sale since the federal restoration had untangled who owned what. She looked at it from the creek bank, the crumbling farmhouse, the fences that needed work, the soil that had been neglected past the point where neglect was recoverable in a single season. She did not feel what she might have expected to feel about it. She felt mostly the distance between the girl who had sat on that porch waiting for a wagon and the woman sitting on this horse now, and found that the distance was significant enough that the farm was not quite her past anymore. It was a place where a past had happened. The distinction mattered. She turned her horse and rode back north. The broken spur, after Cutter, became something else. A portion of it was redistributed through the restoration proceedings. The main property, the house, the central barns, the operated portion of the range, was sold at public auction to a cooperative of valley ranchers who had pooled what they had and bought it together, an arrangement that was awkward and contentious and unprecedented and somehow, improbably, functional. Pryor held a share. He attended the first cooperative meeting in his chair, which had been brought out again, and he sat in it and said very little and occasionally offered a piece of advice that was very specific and extremely useful, which was his established mode. He died 2 winters later in his bed at 83 on his own land. The chair was kept. Denton Mercer told Rosalie about the death with the quiet directness of a man passing on news that was sad but not surprising. He said to tell you, Mercer said, that you argued like someone who expected to win. He said that was the right approach. She thought about that for a long time. It was, she decided, the most accurate thing anyone had said about her. She had expected to win, not with the arrogance of someone who didn't understand the odds, but with the particular stubbornness of someone who had looked at the odds and decided that the odds were not the last word. They almost never were. The odds told you what to expect. They didn't tell you what was possible. What was possible was Bess Mercer's east pasture, running green again with water that was legally and irrevocably hers. What was possible was Tom Calloway and May and their children on land that bore their name in the county record, unaltered, accurately surveyed. What was possible was 11 families who had stood in a canyon one morning with their fear still visible and their feet still planted and had not moved. What was possible was a girl loaded onto a wagon on a silent porch, arriving a year later at something she had built herself. Not granted, not given, not bestowed by anyone's mercy or anyone's recognition, but built day by day from the specific materials available: attention, stubbornness, an unwillingness to accept that the only definition of her was the one other people had written. Rosalie Vance. She'd taken his name and he'd offered it without ceremony, and she'd accepted it the same way, stood on the porch of the ranch on the hillside on an evening in the 5th year, and looked south toward the valley and the distant canyon country and thought about none of this in organized terms. She was thinking, practically, about the winter feedstock and whether they had enough put aside, and about the young couple who were breaking ground on their own claim 6 miles north, and about a letter she owed Aldridge that she'd been putting off because she wasn't sure how to say what she wanted to say. She was thinking about ordinary things. That was the victory, finally. Not the ruling, not the standing in the canyon, not the warrant served on a powerful man's porch. The victory was ordinary days. The right to have them, the right to stand on her own porch and think about winter feedstock and owe someone a letter and belong. Not because anyone had given her permission, but because she had been here long enough and done enough real work and put down roots deep enough that belonging was simply what it was. Behind her, inside, Coulter was moving around the kitchen, making something that smelled like it was going to be mediocre at best. He could do many things well, and cooking was not among them. And she had stopped trying to fix this about him because some things about people were not problems. They were just facts. And you chose your facts. She went inside. The door closed behind her, and the evening settled over the hillside, and the valley below went dark the way the valley had always gone dark. Slowly, all at once, the same as everything.